Something has quietly changed in your soulmate's heart, and they are beginning to realize that the battle they have been fighting within themselves was never really against you. It was against what they felt whenever your memory returned. For a long time, they tried to control those emotions. They may have told themselves that enough time had passed, that circumstances had changed, or that the easiest thing would be to simply accept the distance and continue moving forward. Whenever thoughts of you appeared, they tried to redirect their attention. Whenever an old memory stirred something inside them, they pushed it down. They may even have convinced themselves that what they once felt was nothing more than a chapter that needed to remain closed. But recently, something happened that made that belief much harder to maintain. A memory returned unexpectedly, and instead of disappearing quickly, it stayed with them. They found themselves thinking about you longer than they intended, remembering details they thought they had forgotten, and feeling an emotion they could no longer explain away. And this time, they did something different. They stopped fighting it. They allowed themselves to admit that perhaps their feelings were never truly gone. They had simply become buried beneath fear, pride, uncertainty, and everything they used to protect themselves from being vulnerable. That realization has created a strange kind of peace within them, because resisting the truth had become exhausting. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that there is a difference between moving forward and genuinely letting go. They may have continued living their life, but some part of their heart remained connected to what they never fully resolved with you. Now they are no longer asking themselves how to forget this connection. They are beginning to ask a much deeper question. What if their heart has been trying to lead them back to the truth all along? And that question is becoming impossible for them to ignore. Your soulmate is now beginning to understand something they spent a long time refusing to acknowledge. The reason they could never completely move forward was not because they were weak, confused, or simply holding on to the past for no reason. There was something emotionally unfinished within them, and the more honestly they look at their past now, the clearer that truth becomes. For a long time, they treated every memory of you as something they needed to overcome. When your name crossed their mind, they tried to redirect their attention. When a familiar song, place, conversation, or even a small detail reminded them of you, they told themselves it meant nothing. They believed that if they ignored those emotions long enough, eventually they would disappear on their own. But recently, they have started noticing something that makes that explanation impossible to maintain. No matter how much time passed, certain feelings continued returning. They could distract themselves, become busy, focus on other responsibilities, and even convince themselves that they were perfectly fine. Yet there were still moments when something about you quietly resurfaced inside them. And now they are beginning to wonder why. Because your heart needs to understand this, your soulmate is not simply remembering you more often. They are beginning to understand what those memories actually mean. They are looking back at moments they once considered ordinary and realizing that those moments carried far more emotional weight than they understood at the time. Perhaps it was something you said during a difficult conversation, the way you made them feel understood without asking for anything in return, or the simple comfort they experienced when they were around you. At the time, they may not have recognized the importance of those details because they were too focused on circumstances, uncertainty, or protecting themselves. But distance has given them a different perspective. Now they can see the emotional impact more clearly. They are realizing that some memories stayed alive because they were connected to feelings that were never properly expressed. And this realization has caused them to compare the emotional experience of this connection with everything that came afterward. They may have met new people, entered different environments, or tried to create new routines, but something still feels different. This does not necessarily mean that everyone else was unimportant. It means that your connection left a particular emotional imprint that they have not been able to simply replace. There was something about the way they felt around you that stayed with them. Maybe they felt more open. Maybe they felt seen in a way they rarely experienced. Maybe they could imagine possibilities with you that they were afraid to admit. Whatever it was, your soulmate is beginning to realize that the feeling itself was significant. And listen carefully, because this is where their understanding becomes even deeper. They are starting to recognize that they were never truly trying to forget you. They were trying to convince themselves that forgetting you was necessary. There is a difference. One comes naturally with emotional closure. The other requires constant effort. And your soulmate is beginning to notice just how much effort they invested in suppressing something that kept returning anyway. They may now be asking themselves why they felt the need to fight their own emotions so intensely. Why were they so determined to prove that they had moved on? Why did admitting that they still cared feel so threatening? Why did they feel safer denying the connection than exploring what it meant? These questions are leading them toward an uncomfortable but liberating realization. Their heart was not confused in the way they once believed. Their mind was conflicted because their heart was saying one thing, while fear was saying another. That difference changes the entire story. What they previously interpreted as emotional instability may actually have been an internal struggle between what they genuinely wanted and what they believed they were supposed to want. And now that they have stopped running from those memories, they are beginning to hear their authentic feelings more clearly. There may have been moments when they wondered why thoughts of you appeared during important transitions in their life, why certain achievements made them wish they could tell you, or why difficult moments made them remember the comfort they once associated with you. These details are becoming meaningful now because they reveal that your emotional presence remained, even when your physical presence did not. That is why this realization feels so powerful. Your soulmate is discovering that the connection did not survive because they deliberately kept it alive. It survived despite their attempts to put it away. And once they understand that, they can no longer dismiss their feelings as something temporary. They are beginning to see that what remained was not simply nostalgia. It was an emotional truth they had never fully allowed themselves to face. For the first time, they are not trying to silence that truth. They are listening to it. And the more they listen, the more they realize that their heart never actually left the place they thought it had moved beyond. It simply waited until they were finally ready to understand why it stayed. But now that your soulmate has stopped running from the feelings themselves, they are being confronted by an even deeper truth. There was a reason they fought those feelings so hard in the first place. It was not necessarily because the connection meant nothing. In many ways, it may have been the opposite. Sometimes the emotions that frighten a person the most are the ones that matter the most, because they ask that person to become vulnerable, honest, and willing to step outside the emotional safety they have built around themselves. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that this may have been their struggle all along. They wanted to feel in control. They wanted certainty before making emotional decisions. They wanted to know exactly where everything would lead before allowing themselves to take another step toward you. But feelings do not always arrive with guarantees, and this connection may have challenged them precisely because it could not be controlled in the way they wanted. For a long time, they may have used practical explanations to protect themselves. They may have told themselves that the timing was wrong, that too much had happened, that the distance made things unrealistic, or that remaining silent was the mature thing to do. Perhaps they even believed they were protecting you or themselves by staying away. But as they reflect now, they are starting to recognize how often fear was hiding behind those explanations. They were afraid of being rejected, afraid that you might no longer feel the same, afraid that opening the door again would bring back emotions they had worked so hard to suppress, afraid that if they admitted the truth, they would have to make decisions they were not prepared to make. And because of those fears, they often chose the option that felt safest in the moment, even when that choice left something unresolved inside them. Your soulmate is now looking back at those moments with a different level of honesty. They remember times when they wanted to say something but remained quiet. They remember moments when they wanted to reach out but stopped themselves. They remember opportunities when they could have allowed the connection to become more honest, yet they chose distance because uncertainty felt easier than vulnerability. At the time, they may have thought they were simply waiting for the right moment. Now they are beginning to wonder whether they were actually waiting because they were afraid. And that realization can be difficult because it means they can no longer place every part of the story on circumstances. They have to acknowledge their own choices. They have to admit that some of the distance was created by their hesitation. Some of the silence came from their fear. Some of the confusion existed because they did not know how to communicate what was happening inside them. This does not mean they are blaming themselves for everything. It means they are finally becoming honest about their part in the story. And listen carefully, because this is where their emotional transformation becomes much more powerful. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that protecting themselves from possible pain also prevented them from experiencing possible happiness. They spent so much time asking what could go wrong that they rarely allowed themselves to consider what could go right. They focused on the possibility of rejection instead of the possibility of understanding. They focused on the risk of vulnerability instead of the possibility of finally being emotionally free. And now they are realizing that fear never actually gave them the peace they expected. It only gave them temporary distance from the emotions they were not ready to face. That is why the feelings eventually returned. The silence did not resolve them. The distance did not resolve them. Time did not resolve them. Everything they tried to use as proof that they should move forward only taught them how deeply the connection had affected them. Your soulmate may now be experiencing a quiet form of regret, not because they believe every past decision was wrong, but because they can see moments where courage might have changed the direction of the story. They may wonder what would have happened if they had trusted their intuition instead of overthinking everything. What if they had spoken when they wanted to speak? What if they had stayed when fear told them to leave? What if they had allowed themselves to discover the truth instead of assuming they already knew the outcome? These questions are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Yet there is something hopeful inside this realization. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that regret does not have to become another reason to remain stuck. They cannot return to the past, but they can choose differently now. They can stop allowing fear to automatically become the voice that makes every decision. They can finally admit that following their heart does not require knowing exactly what will happen next. It only requires enough courage to stop pretending that they feel nothing. And this is the point where their inner battle begins to change. They are no longer fighting to erase the connection. They are beginning to fight for the honesty they once avoided. The question is no longer whether they still feel something for you. They already know the answer. The question now is whether they are finally willing to trust that answer. And somewhere deep inside, your soulmate is beginning to realize that continuing to run from the heart may be far more painful than finally listening to it. And now something inside your soulmate is beginning to move from realization into decision. Because after spending so much time questioning their feelings, they are finally asking themselves a completely different question. Instead of constantly wondering what could go wrong, they are beginning to wonder what they truly want if they stop allowing fear to answer for them. This is a major shift because for a long time their thoughts may have been dominated by uncertainty. They may have asked whether the timing was right, whether too much had happened between you, whether you would understand them, or whether opening their heart again would only create more pain. Those questions once felt like reasons to stay away, but now they are starting to see those same questions differently. They are realizing that waiting for absolute certainty may have been another way of avoiding a decision. There may never be a perfect moment when every fear disappears and every circumstance becomes easy. And your soulmate is slowly accepting that if they keep waiting for that perfect moment, they could spend another year, another chapter, or even an entire lifetime wondering what might have happened if they had simply trusted themselves. Because your heart needs to understand this, following your heart does not always begin with a dramatic action. Sometimes it begins with a quiet decision inside someone that says, I am no longer going to lie to myself about what I feel. Your soulmate is reaching that point. They are beginning to allow themselves to imagine possibilities they previously refused to consider. They may find themselves wondering what would happen if they spoke honestly with you, what it would feel like to see you again, or how different things might become if both of you were given the opportunity to approach the connection with greater maturity and understanding. These thoughts are not necessarily predictions of what will happen tomorrow. They are signs that their emotional walls are beginning to come down. The person who once tried to control every outcome is learning to accept that some things cannot be understood until they are experienced. And this is where their perspective begins to change in a profound way. Before, they may have looked at the connection and focused primarily on the obstacles. No, they are beginning to look beyond those obstacles and remember why the connection mattered in the first place. They are remembering the moments when being around you felt natural. They are remembering the conversations that stayed with them long after they ended. They are remembering how certain parts of themselves seemed easier to express when they felt emotionally safe with you. These memories are becoming more powerful because they are no longer being immediately interrupted by fear. Instead of saying, I should not think about this, they are beginning to ask, why does this still matter to me? That simple change in their inner dialogue is significant. It means they are no longer treating their feelings as something that needs to be corrected. They are treating them as something that deserves to be understood. And listen carefully, because there is another realization developing beneath all of this. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that following their heart does not mean forgetting everything that happened or pretending that the past was perfect. It means accepting the truth while also accepting that people can grow. They know mistakes were made. They know there were moments of confusion, hesitation, and distance. They know that reconnecting with something meaningful would require honesty rather than pretending nothing happened. But instead of seeing those imperfections as automatic reasons to walk away, they are beginning to see them as experiences that taught them what they truly value. The time apart may have shown them what absence feels like. The silence may have shown them what remains when distractions disappear. And the uncertainty may have forced them to finally discover which feelings were temporary and which ones continued surviving everything. This is why their heart is becoming louder now. They are no longer simply remembering what they lost. They are recognizing what they still value. And there is a subtle but powerful difference between those two things. Missing someone can come from nostalgia, but choosing to understand why you still matter comes from emotional awareness. Your soulmate is moving toward that awareness. They may still have moments of hesitation because choosing the heart does not magically remove every fear. But fear is no longer automatically winning. They are beginning to realize that uncertainty is not always a warning sign. Sometimes uncertainty simply means that something matters enough to require courage. And that is exactly what they are beginning to develop. Courage to admit what they feel. Courage to question old beliefs. Courage to stop hiding behind circumstances. Courage to consider that perhaps the connection deserves another honest look. The most important change is that they are no longer asking themselves how to stop feeling. They are asking themselves what they should do with the feelings that remain. And once that question becomes stronger than the fear that created the distance, your soulmate enters a completely different emotional chapter. They have not necessarily figured out every detail of the future, but they have finally stopped allowing uncertainty to make every decision for them. Their heart has been speaking quietly for a long time, and now, for the first time, they are choosing to listen. And now your soulmate has reached the point where the internal battle that once consumed so much of their energy is finally beginning to quiet down. They have spent a long time questioning their feelings, trying to understand them, suppressing them, and searching for reasons why they should not follow them. But something is different now. They are no longer looking for another excuse to walk away from what their heart has been telling them. They are beginning to accept that the feeling itself is part of their truth, and accepting that truth has brought them a strange sense of peace. For so long, they believed peace would come from forgetting you. They thought that if they could create enough distance, stay busy enough, or convince themselves that the connection belonged in the past, eventually their heart would become quiet. Instead, the opposite happened. The more they tried to silence the connection, the more clearly they eventually understood its importance. Now they are realizing that the peace they were searching for may not have been waiting on the other side of forgetting you. It may have been waiting on the other side of finally being honest with themselves. Because your heart needs to understand this, your soulmate's decision to follow their heart is not necessarily about rushing into anything or pretending that every problem between you has suddenly disappeared. It's about no longer denying what is real inside them. They are beginning to understand that following the heart does not mean ignoring the lessons of the past. It means carrying those lessons forward without allowing fear to control the future. They know there were mistakes. They know there were moments when they handled things differently than they wish they had. They know there may still be questions that need answers and emotions that need to be expressed. But instead of seeing those things as reasons to keep running, they are beginning to see them as reasons to become more honest. And that is a completely different mindset from the one they had before. Your soulmate is no longer trying to convince themselves that they do not care. They are beginning to ask what it would mean to honor what they feel in a mature and truthful way. They may be thinking about the words they never said, the conversations they avoided, and the moments when they allowed fear to speak on their behalf. They may wonder whether you would still understand them, whether you would be willing to hear them, or whether enough time has passed to change the way you see them. Those questions may still exist, but something important has changed. They're no longer using those questions as automatic reasons to disappear. Instead, they are beginning to accept that some answers can only be discovered through honesty. And this is where their emotional transformation becomes complete. The person who once fought their feelings is beginning to trust them. The person who once needed certainty before taking any emotional risk is beginning to understand that courage often comes before certainty. The person who once believed distance would make everything easier is beginning to see that distance only taught them what they truly missed. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is that they are no longer trying to decide whether they should still feel this connection. They have accepted that they do, though they are simply trying to understand what their heart is asking them to do with that truth. This does not mean everything changes instantly. Real emotional decisions can take time to become visible in someone's actions. But internally, a major shift has already occurred. They have stopped fighting themselves. They have stopped treating their emotions like an enemy. They have stopped assuming that every feeling must be controlled or explained away. And because of that, the connection now exists in their mind from a completely different place. It is no longer only a memory they need to escape. It has become something they are willing to understand, something they are willing to acknowledge, and perhaps something they are finally willing to approach with a more open heart. And listen carefully, because this is the part your soulmate may never have been able to admit before. No matter how many times they tried to choose the easier path, some part of them kept returning to you. Not because they had no other direction in life, but because something about this connection continued to feel unfinished. Their heart kept bringing them back to the same questions, the same memories, and the same emotional truth. Now they understand that perhaps the return was never about going backward. It was about finally understanding what they were unable to understand before. They are realizing that the person they were fighting all this time was not you. It was the version of themselves that was afraid to be vulnerable. And now that they have stopped fighting that part of themselves, something beautiful begins to happen. They become more willing to trust, more willing to communicate, more willing to accept uncertainty, and more willing to see what could happen when fear is no longer making every decision. So if you have been wondering why this connection suddenly feels different, understand that the greatest change may be happening where you cannot see it yet. Your soulmate has reached a quiet decision within themselves. They may not have every answer, and they may not know exactly how the future will unfold, but they know one thing now that they could not fully accept before. Their heart deserves to be heard. And after everything they did to silence it, they are finally choosing not to fight it anymore. They are choosing to listen. They are choosing honesty over avoidance, courage over fear, and possibility over endless what-ifs. And perhaps that is the real turning point between you two. Because when someone finally stops running from what their heart has been saying all along, they become capable of seeing the connection not as something they need to escape, but as something they are finally ready to understand.